My grandmother lived till she was 100, and she was the first person who really gave me a sense, my first sense, that the women who came of age in her generation, in the 1920s and 30s, were less Victorian than the women who came of age in my mother's generation in the 50s and early 60s. It was sort of a backward aspect of the development of women in American society. Now, to put this as from an example standpoint, my grandmother was an aristocrat from Boston. She didn't marry until she was 30, but over the years she'd been proposed to a number of times, including twice by my grandfather, and she kept saying, no, 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 no thank you, no thank you. And one weekend, she and all of her friends are gathered at a party on the ocean, and my grandmother notices that there's a new young blonde in the circle who has been sort of following my grandfather around. My grandmother's watching this with narrowed eyes. And so on Saturday night, the night of the big cocktail party, this blonde arrives in white furs in summer, and she goes right out on the dock, sort of right after my grandfather. So my grandmother quickly follows this blonde out on the dock and gets kind of right up next to her and gives her one of these and knocks her into the ocean in her furs. Now, when she told me this story, she then pauses and says, "And that's when I decided to marry your grandfather." Because this is the way that grown-ups make decisions. When I came to New York, I moved here when I was 25, and shortly thereafter, my sister followed me, and she began dating a friend of mine, and after a year or so, they decided to move in together. So my mother and her two sisters were all aflutter over this. What are we going to tell Grandma that Kimbrough and Daniel are moving in together, and they're not even engaged? And we should get her a post office box. This was the genuine proposal, to fool Grandma about where the mail was going. So my sister says, "Listen, I'm not going to lie to Grandma. I'm not going to lie to Grandma." So she sits my grandmother down and she says, "Grandma, you've met Dan. We're very much in love. We're moving in together, and it's terrific." And my grandmother is noticeably upset. And so my sister starts to backpedal. She's saying, times, we're trying to save money, times have changed. And my grandmother's like, no, Kimbrough, no, that's not it at all. That's not it at all. My concern is that if you move in with Daniel, how are you going to see other men? And my mother is like, oh! Right, so as I say, I was not raised in this world of my grandmother's. I was raised in the world of my mother's. We lived in a suburb outside of Boston, in Dedham, Massachusetts. As a town, it was very careful, conservative, and homogeneous, which come to think of it also describes my parents. So I was living there, and I couldn't wait to move on, as it were. And in my 20s, I was sort of wondering, where am I going to go? In my 20s, I had this sort of weird omen, positive omen, I think, which is that it turned out that 4 of my heroes had written with great enthusiasm about what they had seen while standing on the exact same spot. And that spot is the top of the Brooklyn Bridge, looking back at Manhattan. Jack Kerouac, in 1965, wrote rhapsodically about this. 30 years earlier, Le Corbusier, the great French modernist architect, he wrote about that experience. 10 years before that, Pablo Neruda came from Spain. He stood on the bridge and wrote about the experience. And in that same year of 1925, Vladimir Mayakovsky, the poet laureate of the Russian Revolution, this is the guy, you remember, who when he couldn't write the poems that he wanted to, he took a prop revolver and shot himself through the heart, which I was very impressed with as a young man. I thought it was very impressive. But he came all the way from Moscow in 1925, and he walked on the bridge, and he wrote about that experience too. And I'm going to, this is what Mayakovsky had to say about that, quickly. As a madman enters a church, or retreats to a monastery pure and austere, so I, in the haze of evening, humbly approach the Brooklyn Bridge. Like a conqueror with cannons tall as giraffes entering a besieged city, so I, drunk with glory, cross the Brooklyn Bridge. Like a painter whose smitten eyes pierce a museum Madonna, so I look at New York through the Brooklyn Bridge and see the sky and the stars. That sounded pretty good to me. I think at the time, on the one hand, I was thinking when I sort of made this discovery, it's pretty extraordinary, this idea that these four avant-gardists, who all four of them shaped not only their art form, but their era, that having come from four different countries across a span of 40 years, that they had all stood in that spot and rhapsodized about what was in front of them. But on the other hand, instinctively, I knew exactly why. Because, of course, what they were looking at was this great city, this melting pot. And I don't mean simply a melting pot of ethnicities and social classes and religions, which, of course, it is. It's also the melting pot of the creative, the courageous, the corrupt. It's the melting pot of the four cardinal virtues and the seven deadly sins. It's the melting pot of all human passions. So it's quite natural for them to be drawn to it, and I was. I knew that that's where I wanted to come. Sort of like Philip Petit, who tiptoed across the high wire that he had strung between Tower 1 and Tower 2. I wanted to come to New York and walk across the Brooklyn Bridge, which is the biggest tightrope in the world. That's the way I thought of it, at any rate. So the minute I finished school, I packed my car with all my stuff, drove to New York City, and I moved in with a childhood friend in an illegal sublet in the East Village. Now, at that time, just a few blocks away in Alphabet City, this is when the squatters had barricaded themselves in their brownstones and were throwing televisions off the rooftops onto the cop cars when they passed below. And my immediate neighbor was the New York City headquarters of the Hells Angels, with all the Harley Davidsons lined up out front. And I was thinking, this is terrific. So one Saturday morning, shortly after coming to New York, I was walking into the Lower East Side to pick up breakfast, and an older gentleman, he stops me. He's in dark clothes with a long white beard, and he says, "Excuse me, but are you the sort of person who, when you meet a person who needs help, that you would help this person?" And I thought, that's a hell of a question. But, I like to think that I'm a person who would help a stranger in need. So I said, "Sure, what can I do for you?" He goes, Good, come this way. So there on the corner of Houston Street is a 2-story gray nondescript building. I must have passed it 100 times. I never even noticed it. But he leads me inside, and we go down a narrow staircase into the basement. Now, this must have been before I saw Silence of the Lambs, because I don't know what I was thinking. But nonetheless, down we go, and there in the basement are 2 long tables covered with food, surrounded by men, women, and children, and they're in the dark. Now, what this turned out to be was an Orthodox synagogue. And as you know, in the Orthodox tradition, the Sabbath, Saturday, is honored by a prohibition against work, and this includes a prohibition against using electronic devices. So the tradition is you put the lights on Friday night, and when you arrive on Saturday, they're on for you. But now someone had carelessly turned off the lights on Friday, and here the congregation, after their service, was gathered, for their weekly meal in pitch black. Now, in the Orthodox tradition, it is it is also prohibited to ask somebody to work on your behalf. This is viewed as cheating. So, in this terrifically roundabout way, this older man starts to say, "As you go around the room, should you see a string hanging from the ceiling, and if you are curious about the purpose of this string, you should explore your curiosity." So I'm getting the picture. So I'm going around the room, and I'm exploring my curiosity with strings, various strings. And these young men are leaping off of benches saying, "No, he mustn't do that." And the old man's saying, "No, it's okay, go with God, go with God." But you got to sort of look at it from my perspective, right? Having come from this homogeneous suburb, here I am, and my next door neighbors are the Hells Angels, and around the corner is this Orthodox Jewish community, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find two subsets of the American population that are farther apart. I mean, these two groups are radically different in their worldview, in their habits, their cuisine. The only thing that these two groups have in common are the beards. That's it. But there they are, living side by side, abiding, each other's existence, nodding, to each other in the street, putting up with, me and sort of letting me wander through their neighborhood. So I thought this was just great. And I remember coming home from this experience, and I was in our apartment, feeling very excited, and I really thought, I've made it. I am where I am meant to be. I am about to disappear into the great urban whirlwind of Walt Whitman. That was kind of my mindset. And then the telephone rang. And I'm thinking maybe it is Walt Whitman. And I pick it up. Oh, hi, Mom. Okay, so now, I should say that when this call comes, I have not spoken to my mother in about 6 months. And here is the first thing I say. Hey, so how'd you get this number? Terrible, okay. So my mother, I should set this up, at this point is a divorcee. She has moved to Naples, Florida. She's living in a condominium, and she's approaching 60. And it's clear, the minute I pick up the phone, she's very excited. And so I say, what's going on? She says, well, I've been taking a modeling class. I say, well, you mean like modeling with clay? No, Amor, fashion modeling, like Cindy Crawford. I'm like, oh, you got to be kidding me, right? So now my mother, taking this class, things are going so well in the class that she explains to me that she has decided to enroll in the national open runway modeling competition. Further, she explains that to this end, she has spent the last few weeks mastering her pause, pose, and pivot. You mean your pause, pose, and pivot? I mean, what? And she's now, of course, you've already figured this out. But the pause, pose, and pivot is what happens at the end of the runway, right? You walk down and you pause, you sort of give a little bit of pose, you pivot, and head back through the curtain. And my mother is mastering this, but she says, now I have perfected my pause and my pivot. My problem is that I have 10 promising poses, and I cannot choose which one I should use. Big dilemma there. So now, with great foreboding, I ask the next question. The next question is, hey, Mom, where is this competition? New York City. It's in New York City at the Times Square Hilton. Next Saturday, in the Renaissance Room at 2 p.m. Come early. So, being a dutiful son, I do. I go to the Hilton Hotel in Times Square shortly before 2 p.m., and I go through the revolving doors and up the escalator to the mezzanine level, where there's this giant billboard, and it's got all the different events, because you have to picture this open, all-age runway competition with people from all across the country coming to be looked at. It's basically like open mic night for the human body, what it is. But there on the board, sure enough, in the Renaissance Room at 2 p.m., is the seniors' women's bathing suit competition. So I go to the Renaissance Room, and I take a seat in the way back. A couple hundred people here. I sit very low in my chair, and I'm consoling myself with the thought that, I mean, how long could a model be on a runway, right? Is it 30 seconds, 40 seconds, maybe 50? The music begins. It is a medley of Madonna's music. Yes, it includes Like a Virgin. And the women start coming out on the runway, and there, contestant number 4, in a black bathing suit, thank God it's a one-piece, is my mother. And she's coming down, and she gets to towards the end, and there is her pause, and there is her pose, but there is no pivot. Instead, my mother goes from pause 1 to pause 2 to pause 3 to pause 4. Now, picture, meanwhile, the other contestants are coming down the runway. So there's sort of a pileup right behind her. And one of these older women is trying to elbow my mother out of the way so that she can have her moment at the end of the runway. But my mother is a little bit like the squatters back in Alphabet City. She knows she's got a good piece of New York City real estate that's costing her nothing, and she's not going to give it up until she's damn well ready to do so. She's going to stand right there in that spotlight until she does all 10 poses, which is what she did. Now, at the moment, I was, thought it was sort of hilarious and shocking at the same time. But in the subway on my way home by myself, what really struck me about this experience, sort of the revelation that struck me, is that on that runway in the Renaissance room of the Times Square Hilton, my mother, in her black bathing suit, working her way through the 10 poses, she was farther out on the tightrope than I had ever been. So the moral of this story is, when in danger, if there's a crisis, if you can't get a hold of Mayakovsky, call your mom. Thanks very much.